Hello knitters, Barbara Benson here. I am an independent knitwear designer who also likes to make videos on my channel, Watch Barbara Knit, here on the YouTube, so I can talk to you about knitting and all things fiber knitting related. I can talk about knitting a lot. If you would like to see any of my patterns that I have available for sale for you to knit, please check in the description below and you will find a link to my Ravelry store where you can buy my patterns. And today I'm just going to chat with you about something that I think every knitter tries to do at some point, and that I think every knitter, including me, fails at some point, but that is a recurring thing that it's much more complicated than it appears, and that is yarn substitution. And what I mean by yarn substitution is taking a pattern that has been designed in a specific yarn and then substituting a different yarn for the yarn that the designer has chosen for that particular piece. Maybe you don't like the color, maybe it's been discontinued, any number of reasons why you would want to substitute yarn. There's a lot more to think about than might on the surface appear. The first thing I think we need to define is, what are you trying to accomplish? What is your goal in substituting the yarn? And the reason why I'm saying that is, as I said, there's many different reasons to do it, and one of which is substituting yarn to change the size of something, which is a whole different ball of wax. I can show you an example. I'm going to try to put a picture someplace. My pattern Golden Lion Throne is in fingering weight yarn, and it is a long but very shallow scarf shawly thing. It's crescent, I love it, but it's a different shape, and some people have wanted it to be deeper, and there really isn't a way to extend the pattern, but I did this version of it where I substituted a worsted weight yarn for the fingering weight yarn. Of course, I had to re-swatch, and I had to figure out what needle size is going to work better with the pattern. And also, you can just throw whatever the pattern says about yardage out the window, because once you change the yarn size, the yardage, it's going to tell you nothing. So this type of substitution, while entirely possible, and you can do that and you can change sizes, are for either very experienced knitters who know how to do this kind of thing, or very adventurous knitters, which, hey, I'm all for it. It's just yarn. If it doesn't work, frog that puppy and you're ready to go. You can use the yarn for something else or try again. So that is one thing you can do. If you're actively trying to change the pattern, go for it. But that's not what I'm talking about today. What I want to talk about today is if you're wanting to substitute yarn while maintaining the look and size and structure and drape of the existing piece. So starting at that level, we're trying to keep it the same. We want it to look like the piece, but we just have change, we want visual changes. I'm going to break it down into 3 things that you really need to think about. You need to think about your yarn weight, you need to think about your yarn content, and you need to think about your yarn structure. The first thing is looking at your pattern and determining what weight the yarn is. Now, I have been a fly on a wall in a yarn store where I saw someone come in and ask for help substituting yarn. They're like, so I have this pattern and I want to make this pattern. I need fingering weight yarn because it says fingering weight yarn. And then the shop person took it and looked at it and said, well, this says a size 7 needle. So a size 7 needle, you don't need fingering weight yarn. You need a heavier yarn. You need like a DK weight yarn because that's what you knit with a 7. don't trust that. It's one way to approach it, but with the way designers are like playing with drape and playing with stuff, I mean, I have one pattern that calls for DK weight yarn and it's knit on 11s, but that's because the yarn is held double. So don't just look at the needle size and say, for this needle size, I need this size yarn. Look at the pattern and see what yarn the pattern calls for. Don't just see what weight, like it's sport weight, because fast and loose with what weight is. Okay, you got sport weight, you've got fingering, but within those you have a wide range. So what I like to look at is the number of yards per weight. Usually it's yards per gram, and compare those numbers. And I wanted to give you an example why you would need to do this. So I have this yarn and I have this yarn, right? Both of these are considered sport weight yarns, okay? I'm going to show you. They look, they're roughly the same if you just look at them, and I think that they probably would substitute fairly well if you have a pattern. And if you had a pattern written in this yarn and you said, I'm going to substitute, and this pattern calls for 3 skeins, which would be 50 grams, I'm just going to substitute 50 grams for 50 grams, right? But if you look at the label on this one, so this one is 200 yards in 50 grams. This one has 170 yards in 50 grams. If you needed 3 skeins, and a pattern calls for 3 skeins, 3 times 200 is 600, 170 times 3 is 510. So you're going to come up 90 yards short. So you have to pay attention to that. Another thing going on here is entering into my second point, which is yarn content. This is an alpaca cotton blend, and this is 100% wool. That could be accounting for the weight and the different yardages and all those kinds of things. So you need to look at, first, how many yards per gram you're getting, and you need to make sure that you're having, and if you imagine that you have a big ball of fluff, right? And you're spinning it out. The more you pull it out, the more yardage you're going to get, but the thinner the yarn is going to get. So you can take 50 grams of yarn and pull it out and get 200 yards, which is more in your sport, or even thinner into a fingering weight. Or you can pull it out and only get 70 yards, and then you're going to have a bulky yarn. So you can't just say, I need 50 grams of yarn. You need to look at the weight, and you need to look at the yardage in that weight to compare them. If you want effective substitution, yarn content, you probably want to try to keep it in the same ballpark, because there are many reasons that designers choose different yarn contents. And as we saw in our example, the difference of what that is can make a huge difference. It can make you 90 yards short. And what you get in there, how to example. So it affects the weight and how much yardage you're going to get, but it also affects how those yarns perform. If you take a sweater that was designed for 100% wool and just substitute in, let's say it's worsted weight, and just substitute in a worsted weight cotton, it might not work, because cotton, when it's block and when it's worn, behaves differently. As you wear it, the weight of the yarn is going to pull the whole thing down, especially if it's a piece that was like just knit in the round. So that is why a lot of cotton sweaters are designed at a tighter gauge, or it has seams to provide structure to prevent things from drooping. So you might want to think about the fact that the designer maybe had a reason for choosing that particular yarn to go with that particular pattern. The pattern I have back here has a whole bunch of beads on it. I mean, a lot of beads on it, and they have a lot of weight. So the yarn I used has a wool silk blend because the silk brings strength to the yarn and it helps keep its shape better with all the weight of the beads on it. You can substitute a 100% wool for it and it will work. But if you get into more delicate yarns, like if you wanted to substitute like an alpaca, you might run into problems. And that's another thought. Putting beads on alpaca can be a little bit fiddly. And substituting alpaca or another fuzzy yarn in something that has cables can obscure the visual appeal of your cables. So you need to think of yarn content in that context. And then also yarn structure, talking about cables. If you substitute a fuzzy yarn like an alpaca or anything else, a yarn that's going to flatten, and you have a cable pattern, then your cable's not gonna be as happy for you. So look at the structure of the yarn that the designer chose for your pattern and see if it has. So if it's something with like really good stitch definition and a nice round yarn, a lot of that could be what makes you happy about the look of the cables. And if you substitute something with a different structures, like a single ply or a chain ply or something that's going to behave differently, those cables might not pop up as well for you. And it also can get into like singles. Singles are fabulous and they're beautiful, but because of the way they're made, they don't tend to hold a block quite as well as a plied yarn. So you're blocking it and it'll look pretty, but then it kind of starts drawing back. So if you're making a lace shawl, you might not want to keep that in mind, but if it's supposed to be like one of those super, super fine lace shawls, but it will work. But again, the structure of it can affect how many yards you're getting out of grams. And it's all like, it all goes together. So what I want to leave you with is when you're thinking about substituting yarns, you need to think about your yarn weight and consider thinking about it in terms of yards per gram. How many yards are in that ball of yarn? Think about your yarn content. Compare apples to apples. If you have a pattern that's written for 100% silk and you try to sub in something that's like an acrylic blend or something, it's going to behave differently. And that yarn content might be providing what it is that attracts you to that pattern. Silk blocks beautifully if it's a lace piece. If you substitute something that is superwash or has nylon content in it or any other thing that fights that blocking, you're not going to get as crisp of a block. So take that into consideration, and then take into consideration your yarn structure, whether it's a plied yarn, whether it's a single ply, it's a chain ply. All of these things are going to affect how that behaves in your pattern. So I hope that this has clarified some things and not raised more questions. But if it has raised more questions, please feel free to ask in the comments, and I will do my best. If I don't know the answer, I will get you an answer. If you would like me to talk more in depth as opposed to just grazing over about any of the specific things I mentioned here, feel free to ask. I can make another video. If you disagree with something I've said, I want to hear that too, because hey, I learn new stuff every single day, and maybe some of my experiences are not the same experiences that you've had. So please leave me a comment. If you like this video, please click the like button, give me the thumbs up. And if you would like to be notified whenever I post a new video, please subscribe to my channel. There's a subscribe button on the screen and below the video. Thank you so much.